welcome to this episode of the Analytical Innovations Podcast presented by Analytical AI. Today, we're really excited to have Lauren Buitta, the founder and CEO of Girl Security, with us today. So, Girl Security is a nonprofit that really focuses on revolutionizing the national security landscape by empowering girls, women, and minorities to really get involved in ways they haven't been historically. And so the mission is to create equity in national security, but also bring these people that have unique perspectives into that space, because that's really where innovation happens. By way of background, Lauren started in national security in 2003 as a policy analyst with the National Strategy Forum in Chicago, and she specialized in national security law. And since then, she's worked in the city of Chicago with civil rights and zoning, a variety of things. And then it was in 2016 that she founded Girl Security to really advance and get more girls, women into the security field. She's gotten lots of awards. In 2021, she was named one of 50 women making the world a better place by InStyle magazine. Security magazine just a couple years ago named her one of the most influential people in security, which isn't surprising with her work with youth. I feel like if you can influence the youth, that's one of the best ways to influence the future. And so she does all sorts of stuff and really practices innovation, leadership, and diversity, and where those all intersect for national security. And so today we're going to talk about that. One of the quotes, if you're unfamiliar with Lauren's work, that I have here is that a nation is only as secure as its populations, which I think kind of hints at some of the background and some of her viewpoints, which give her a unique perspective that is much needed in the dialogue today. So we're just going to go ahead and hop in and just have a conversation. And at some point, I'll realize that we've been talking for too long, and we'll stop. So, Lauren, thank you so much for being with me today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a privilege. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, I think I don't know that the people that would be listening to this podcast really have a great handle on girl security and what it is. So would you be willing to kind of give us a little bit about girl security, but also kind of your journey into where you're at now and what brought you to found Girl Security?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on it in the introduction, but we really have a vision that if we bring more people into the national security sector, if we democratize conversations around national security, given its influence, that we will yield different types of insights that can help shape more informed and hopefully more endurable solutions. And for girl security, we're of course focused first and foremost on girls and women, because girls and women are security experts. Unlike fields like technology, where we feel like we have to sort of give them hands-on experience to become inspired into STEM pathways, at Girl Security, we can go into pretty much any community and classroom and confidently look girls and young women in the eyes and say, you actually know security, because just statistically, girls and women are subject to different types of risks merely because of their existence and their identity. And so they really do grow up being taught to fear everything, but really not secured from anything. And they are very adaptive and very resilient. So it provides a really solid foundation for us to be able to connect girls' understanding of their personal security, leveling that up to an understanding of national security. And we do that through a number of different facets. We have a workforce program, a national security workforce program that is, I think, one of the only in the nation. And it's a program that we're extremely proud of. We have a nationwide mentorship program, and we're also now building solutions shaped by the insights of people in our programs. So it's a very holistic model. And I think it's important to emphasize that women remain statistically underrepresented across the national security field, government and industry, around anywhere from like 10 to 13% in the military to under 25% in, let's say, the intelligence agencies and diplomacy, and even in cybersecurity and industry, women are underrepresented. And so I always like to say that girl security is sort of an experiment. Like let's see what these solutions look like when we're bringing more people into the discussions and providing access to skills and training. Um, why wouldn't you want as many people involved as possible in securing the country? That's sort of the idea behind the work that we do. And this was very much shaped by a number of my own experiences growing up in Illinois.
Hmm.
My dad was a carpenter, my mom was a nurse. I grew up working construction in college. And even though I attended a very good college, I didn't leave with an understanding of national security. It was in 2002. So after the 9/11 attacks, I was working in a national security think tank. My brother was deployed to Iraq. And I just had this deep sense of national security is this very powerful, influential space. Yet most of the young people I was sitting with at bars on the weekends talking about the wars had a very little understanding of it. And that sort of set girl security in motion. And
Hmm.
then, as you said, in 2016, I'd had the idea for girl security. I actually emailed my brother in Iraq in like 2005 and said, hey, I think I want to start something for girls in national security. And he was like, good luck with that. So every so often I send him a screenshot of that email.
Yeah.
Um, but once cybersecurity became so prevalent and once the AI
Hmm.
conversation became, I started Girl Security in 2016 more as a volunteer effort to understand how girls were thinking about national security. And then we formally incorporated in 2019. And it's just sort of taken off from there.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. It's neat to hear that whole journey. Okay, so where in Illinois did you grow up?
Well, my family first started up in the back of the yards, which is on the south side of Chicago,
Okay.
and then southwest in the suburbs, Worth, Illinois, and then Tinley Park.
Okay, okay, very, very cool. Yeah, I grew up in Crystal Lake, Illinois, which
Okay.
is northwest suburbs,
Yeah, I know.
about 5 minutes away from Woodstock, Illinois, which is where Groundhog Day was filmed. I don't know if you know that, but
I just watched
yeah.
that movie with my kids, and they got a real kick out of it.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It holds up fairly well. It really does. It really does. Um, I I think this notion of bringing girls and women into security because they grow up thinking about security kind of as a native inside of a high risk universe is a really interesting concept. I often like to talk about, innovation comes from bringing people together of different backgrounds, not solely because they're from a different background, but because the more different brains that you can get in a space where people are thinking differently, of course you're going to have innovation because people are going to approach things from a different way. Um, and so I think that the way you put it really encapsulates why it's so important to have women in security is because they kind of come with this high risk mindset that maybe me as a man doesn't natively come to things with. Um, how have you seen that as you've been mentoring these girls through the process? Has that kind of prediction, has that carried out into how they perform in more real world situations? Do you see them carrying that through and really seeing that out in the real world as well?
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that point is there's certainly other communities and populations that are more high risk, but
Mhm.
certainly statistically, girls and women, especially girls in certain communities, they're just studied. It's just they're subject to additional risks. And there's plenty of studies for people who are interested in. studying the brain patterns of how girls versus boys or men versus women assess their physical environments. Again, part of
Hmm.
that is due to just the evolution of risk. And we're not just talking about sort of like present-minded people, it's evolutionary. There's a lot of
Hmm.
studies that sort of feed into the thesis that undermines or undergirds the work that we're doing. Um, I would say that for us, we see their insights adding a layer of sort of value or depth almost every day in the work that we do. As
Hmm.
part of our workforce program, over the course of 18 weeks, they're doing skill building in national security competencies like structured analytics, ethical decision making. Um, but over the course of that, they're doing a design thinking exercise on a national security challenge. The most recent cohort was addressing the impact of AI in national security. And at the end of it, they produce a capstone with a policy brief. And it's both in the questions they ask and in the way that they sort of phrase or see their outcomes, that we know that it's adding just a different perspective to the work, a
Hmm.
different way of thinking about it. Um, I think we also see that certainly in certain pathways, as we watch mentees or fellows, we refer to the people who've been through our workforce program as fellows, enter their career paths. Many of them are at the forefront of emerging technologies where they're leveraging the skills that they've built through our program to contribute to different solutions around things like agentic AI. So we try to be careful to say that, like, it's not better or superior, right? It's complementary. It's just a
Yeah.
different way of thinking about it. And this came up recently with a piece that I wrote for Forbes, which is that there's been a number of studies that have been sort of cautioning that women are avoiding AI. And I was careful to say, it's not necessarily avoidance, it's assessing risk differently. And before we jump the gun on that, we might want to think about perhaps what they're demonstrating is actually the type of responsible AI leadership that we're talking about, that they're not sort of just
Yeah.
jumping feet first into using AI. And so I think in our mind, despite the name, like, we would love some post-gender version of this where we don't have to talk about the sort of
Hmm.
unique attributes of girls and women, but we still do. And so long as we're doing that, we feel like the strongest testament of our work is letting them show by doing, right? Is letting
Yeah.
them show by producing solutions, getting into the workforce, contributing their narratives that we, are a platform for. But it's every day of the work we see, some unique vantage point. And you have to believe when there's girls in our programs that grow up, uh, one of our school partners is on one of the only blocks in the city of Chicago that's not gang controlled, and they're surrounded
Hmm.
by gun violence. They'll show up
Yeah.
for our workforce program and they will have lost a friend, a week before, and they're showing up every day for this program. When they're being asked to discuss the impact of AI on, like, surveillance and policing, for example, they're bringing in at like 14, 15 years old a set of experiences that oftentimes lead to questions that, if not for those experiences, they wouldn't be asked, even by practitioners and people in the field. So that times like thousands, that we serve every year, it's phenomenal, really. I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but
Yeah. No, I mean,
yeah.
as you should be. If you weren't biased, I think that would be its own problem.
No.
Um, so it strikes me as I've been in personally in situations where we've been talking about maybe a playground at a church or entryways to a building, things like that, and then only after the fact, only after everything's kind of already completed, does somebody say, okay, how do I get into here with a wheelchair? It's like,
Mhm.
if my legs don't work and I'm coming in, how do I get in here? And just looking around, and nobody even thought about it, because you didn't have that perspective
So true.
present. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for that with just people from varied backgrounds, because there's just things that you're not going to think about if you've never had to come into contact with it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I'm really interested in what you said about um, how about the viewpoint of how it's shaping uh, use with things like agentic AI. We do a lot of AI work here. I think we've talked about some different things in the past. Um, but in general, with an approach to responsible use of AI, how do you see that viewpoint that you come with, that your fellows come with? How do you see that shaping the way that AI is used?
Yeah, it's a really great probing question that I think we're in the midst of grappling with. I think one of the tools that we designed is called REMI, which is a bi-directional learning tool, because we really believe in the value of intergenerational learning, especially youth to adult. And I think AI is one of those spaces where you do have young people who are, I even hate the phrase digital natives, because it it seems like there's a sense of agency that they've selected into that. And I think it's very
Mm,
much, it's just they're socialized with technology.
yeah.
So there are certain intuitive uses or abilities that they bring into the work at Girl Security, for example. But there's also context and skills and competencies and hindsight that different generations bring to the younger fellows. And so what we are finding now, and a lot of the work that we're doing, we're hosting an event at a high school in DC on agentic AI this fall, is we intentionally design things like war games and simulations to draw out how they are thinking about these issues versus how more senior practitioners are thinking about these issues. But I would say on the whole, um, young people care about responsible use,
Hmm.
even though they may not have been familiar with the concept of ethics. They learn ethical decision making in our program. They want to avoid certain harms. Yet I think there's still a lot of education and context building for youth in general, not just in our program, but youth that we work with through partnerships around that sort of dynamic between, sharing of data, privacy expectations, sort of the power dynamic between an individual and an LLM, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of work that has to go into shaping and informing their understanding of those complexities to even like untap a lot of the insights that they can share on a lot of these things. But I would say in general, they have the same concerns, they're asking the same questions,
Yeah.
uh, they have the same fears. Unfortunately, I think for young people, the narrative around the future of work is so negative right now, in terms
Mm.
of jobs being replaced. They have an additional, I think, fear, a layer of fear around um, sort of the relationship that they'll have with AI once they graduate from school and get into the workforce and things like that. But that's really where they can come in and help shape solutions, so long as the workforce and senior leaders want to reach their hands back and surface their insights, which I think is going to be critical to all of this.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think we're in a weird flux situation in our whole culture with the the powerful LLM, large language model, for folks that haven't heard that before. Uh, AI type models, these things that are trained to sound authoritative but may not actually be, where I think everybody has this assumption that it's going to replace a lot of people's jobs or just change the way that work is done on a fundamental basis. And I think there's still probably an overestimation of its capabilities. Um, I think we're gonna, just like when the camera was invented, you had people move from doing really realistic style paintings into doing really abstract style paintings. I think humanity will continue to evolve and move to where the their value is still seen in the midst of it. But yeah, it certainly can be scary. I'm sure for a lot of folks coming into the new culture that where it's just part of it. And like you said, it's not something that you get to choose. It's just it's there and you've got to deal with it.
And you've got to deal with it. And I think our education system is not, and this is not a criticism, it just is the way it is. It's not agile enough to adapt to the type of impact that AI is currently having
Yeah.
on the dynamic in the classroom, the dynamic between students and teachers. And so I do think a big challenge, and we try to make an impact in the way that we can, which is to design a very adaptable workforce program that provides those foundational skills that they will need to flourish or thrive in a sort of environment shaped by technology and
Mhm.
geopolitics. But at scale, these are really significant challenges that we're facing. And I think to your point is, I think everyone's up for the challenge. We all want to
Yeah.
see this um, have a positive impact on society, but I do think it's sort of like a whole of nation effort.
Yeah.
And I think from our vantage point, unfortunately, schools, even though they're sort of on the forefront, they also feel like they're the last to be engaged.
Hmm.
And so I think there's a lot more we can be doing to help at the ground level, to help socialize these norms and help equip people with even just those basic frameworks to begin to insert the types of skills and insights that young people will need for their futures.
Yeah. How do you think that you can encourage young people when they're faced with this machine that promises to do all of their thinking for them, when realistically it's just a mirror? How do you encourage them to continue to think for themselves and only, I don't know if only is the right constraint there, but to delegate to the machine what the machine is good at doing without giving away the things that really is their value as a human?
It's so I don't have the I we just had our team call and this was literally the question that was on our minds because I was being told the story of a few 10-year-old girls who were using an AI chatbot that led to an intimate
Hmm.
conversation. And the parents had no idea about, sort of the level of exposure that their child had on their
Yeah.
iPad. Um, so I think it's very much a ground up conversation.
Hmm.
We've been working on a project with one of the leading AI experts, Camille Stewart, to try to get hospitals to include a one-pager in discharge papers for parents about just the basics of technology, because you're often given lots of things when you leave with a baby,
Yeah.
and that actually would be a useful piece of information in
Yeah.
addition to, what to do if your baby has certain symptoms. But starting, I think, to socialize norms and expectations around technology, I think, is one thing. I think helping parents and caregivers do a little bit of like self-diagnostic to expose their level of, I guess, lack of understanding about the different challenges that technology poses is
Hmm.
also quite useful, because I think adults think they know everything, almost like through osmosis, but they actually don't.
Yeah.
And young people are pretty clever and that sort of thing. But I do think different styles of learning can be very effective. Obviously, like experiential, applied learning, design thinking, those are all ways that I think build more gradually toward creating that relationship between youth and technology, as opposed to even what happens in my own children's classroom, which is they're given an iPad and their entire learning experience from the second they enter the classroom is on a piece of technology that
Mm.
educational institutions think have guardrails, but they don't realize that young people can get around a lot of them.
Yeah.
And so, in addition to all of the ways that we know not having to recall information as all of us were socialized actually, impacts neurocognition, um, I think that there's multiple layers of that young people literally have to be led through to do, because this technology is so accessible even on their iPhones. And so again, like I can only speak to how we do what we do, which is to graduate them towards that learning. Everything is applied
Hmm.
learning, experience based. But ultimately, I think it starts like as proximate to the individual as early as possible.
Yeah.
Um, and I think there's some interesting models coming out of schools that are, using less technology in the classroom, but building the competencies outdoors or in alternative forums. I think we're just going to need to experiment with a lot of that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is interesting because I think, like you said, kids are smart. I don't think that they'll have a problem picking the tools up quickly. And if we really see things like the AI as a tool, then really what we need to do is teach critical thinking, those sorts of skills to where when they do have access to the tools, they have the ability to use that background, that high risk aware background that they may have, or whatever it is that their special background is, and say, okay, is this headed the right direction, or is it not? So yeah, no, that's neat. All right, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the word wargaming, which I know very little about, but I did just finish rereading Ender's Game for, like the 50th time, and so that sounds like something from that science fiction book by Orson Scott Card. And so tell me about wargaming and where it fits in your mentorship with the fellows.
Yeah, so we ran our first war game in 2019 at Rand, and we had two of the top war gamers in the country still design a war game for a group of high school girls in our program. This was one of the first ones we ran, and it was a geopolitical incident involving North Korea. Um, and this team had also ran a similar incident with a group of generals and other sort of high-ranking
Hmm.
military officials. And it was an opportunity for them to think critically through a series of decisions that had certain outcomes requiring certain sort of um, subsequent decisions to be made that yielded, a number of scenarios that they had to grapple with. And the goal of a war game, despite how it sounds, is actually to prevent the worst case scenario by
Hmm.
allowing people to sort of go to the worst case means, to the end, so to speak. So, for example, in that war game, bless her, one of the young participants had opted to use nuclear weapons, like within the
Oh,
first, what they call a turn of the game. Um, and it was jarring to people in the room because, it just sort of indicated that this person didn't necessarily understand the implications that that would have within the context of a heated region that has a historically fraught relationship. And ultimately, at the end of that game, which is similar to many others, they shared outcomes and insights that were pretty much on par with senior leaders. These are sort of fundamental human questions that wargaming centers around. And so we use that model of, I wouldn't call it gamifying because that sounds sort of like light,
yeah,
but creating a real world scenario that allows young people to, in a safe and supportive space, to say things like, hey, let's bring out a nuclear weapon without being judged or,
yeah,
made fun of, to sort of think through the implications of that. Because I think in national security, generally speaking, you're oftentimes dealing with situations that have almost no good outcomes, but often require
mm,
very hard decisions. And so it's been a very effective teaching tool for us. And young people really enjoy the experiential side of it, of being able
yeah,
to kind of play the role of the decision maker and, um, have a certain level of responsibility, but also deal with the fallout potentially of having some of the decisions made that oftentimes they'll make.
yeah. It's interesting because I mean, as you describe it, it sounds a lot like role-playing games in other
Oh, for
domains
sure.
like Dungeons and Dragons, things of
Yes.
that nature. And it's wild how that is one of those things that has just become more recently popular. I know there was some Dungeons and Dragons troupe that like sold out Madison Square
Yeah.
Garden to just have people come and watch them play Dungeons and Dragons. So I think that makes sense. It's an immensely engaging tool to be given that role to play and then to play the game. So that's neat to hear that the kids really engage with it.
they do. And it makes sense, right? Because they hear adults talk a lot about different things. But when they have to sort of put themselves in the shoes of someone, it's about as close as they can get to really experiencing something high level. And I would argue that we've done simulations where we've had security leaders play the role of teenagers and teenagers play the role of security leaders. And almost in a similar fashion, because the generational divides are so significant, it's oftentimes as valuable for the senior people who have been in the
Hmm.
security field for a long time than it is for the teenagers, just because, to your point, it allows them to adopt a mindset that opens up a different way of thinking about innovation in whatever their solutions are. So it really is just, I don't know, creating space to just think about how other people see things. Like it feels like such a basic exercise of humanity, but
Hmm.
I think we tend to put it aside sometimes. And I think that's the challenge in national security is the idea of thinking critically or ethically seems counter to innovating and moving fast. But I disagree with that, I guess. I think you can do both.
Hmm. Yeah. All right. I had one last question. I know we've been talking for a minute, and we like to keep these 20 to 30 minutes, something like that. So we'll wrap it up here pretty soon. And just thank you so much for your time. But I had been watching one of I think a video where you were talking online, and you had very specifically said that you are not a scientist. You listed a whole bunch of things that you are not, and one of it was, scientist, things of that nature. But one of the things that I kind of hear you talk about a lot is data, and so what's your story with data? Where does that become important to you, and how has that become more important to you over time, and what's how I guess just what's your relationship with data?
That's quite the question. Let me think this through. I mean, I think with my girl security hat, what we often try, well, first of all, as an organization, we sort of assiduously adhere to the idea that we don't want to tell young people what to think. Our
Hmm.
job is to sort of create a framework for them to think for themselves. So, having said
Okay.
that, what we often find in our discussions with young people is they don't think of their data as something that they exchange for the use of something like a social media platform. And we feel like that's pretty important, right? Because
Hmm.
something that they're freely giving up, where there is this power dynamic, um, is, creating a lot of profit and insights for
Yeah.
lots of different companies. And simply like turning the dial on that and thinking about sort of data through the lens of consumerism, I think is pretty important for young people
Yeah.
because what's different within the national security context is that industry is driving a lot of our national security innovation, but industry doesn't take an oath to the Constitution the way those who work in civil service do. And so you are creating an exchange within environments that are influencing our democracy, but the power dynamic is different. And so I think it's just
Yeah.
important for young people to think about that and decide for themselves how they want their data to be in relationship with some of these, sectors and people who are rather influential. And I think for me, with respect to data, I think a lot about artificial intelligence, agentic AI,
Hmm.
and sort of how we're repeating the sins of our past, right? I mean, we are now uncovering new anthropological understandings of, for example, the role of women versus men as hunters and gatherers. Like we know now that women were hunting and gathering, and that should really challenge how we think about a lot of things, certainly within the national security context. And so, what I worry about is we're building systems that are relying on the data of people who, or I should say, maybe relying too heavily on certain populations of people.
Yeah.
And so I feel it's important to educate youth about how important their engagement is with AI through the lens
Mm.
of
Yeah.
their lived experience and all of those different things. Also recognizing that there are large parts of the world that don't have access to this technology. And so we're
Yeah.
we're forgetting a lot of data that's going to feed these systems that are going to drive a lot of influence and impact for the world. And so I don't think about it necessarily concerning myself. It's more so, how does this shape the work of girl security? How does this shape the ecosystem in which young people are going to enter into? And how can we inject new ways of thinking about it that leverage the foresight that we have to help them think, a few turns around the mountain, so to speak. So that's sort of my relationship with data, I guess. It's not
Yeah,
quite
no,
singular.
I mean that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I do think a good bit as well about just how, yeah, social media platforms, the folks that are making this AI have don't necessarily have the end user's best interest in mind. That's not their end goal. Their end goal is to keep attention on the platform.
Mhm.
And so even with the new LLM models, they haven't figured out how to monetize yet, but they know that it starts with keeping you on the platform.
Yeah.
And so I often tell people that you've really got to think about what is that AI's success metric. Because if it's customer satisfaction and you make a good case for you will be more satisfied if you're given information you're not allowed to have, then it's going to do that because that's what's going to make you a satisfied customer. Um, if it's just keeping you on the platform, social media, I think we see it all the time with um, things becoming more and more divisive or bringing up conflict primarily as just a device for grabbing people's attention. So I think that's a valid point. And then, like you said, these AI tools are built based off of the information they have access to. And so if information isn't represented in the data set, then you're going to end up in a situation where that's not present in the AI either. I had a conversation with somebody. Well, so by my viewpoint, I think that the creation of LLMs will go down as one of the greatest heists in history because they just stole everyone's intellectual property and just put it in these things so that anybody could talk to it. But if you try to roll that back and then like only use stuff that's in the public domain, then suddenly you're looking at all of these books that were written um, either during the civil rights era or pre-civil rights era, and then you're going to end up with all these books that have very particular viewpoints on the world that don't accommodate for the ways that culture and the world has changed since then. And they may have very particular, ways that they talk and think about things. Um, I think you bring up some good points about that, you know, that thought level representation of if the way that I think about things, I'm not putting out there on some way that it's not going to be captured in the cultural narrative.
It's so true. And I think especially, with girls and young women who are statistically predominantly deep faked, for
Hmm.
example. There was just that recent story about that Aptee, where it was women who were reporting men who were violent. Their data was exposed on 4chan. And so people were
Mm.
sharing the photos and license driver
Oh,
numbers.
wow.
And so I think that's where my hope is, that people create space for those insights because uh, I go back to that idea that women are avoiding AI, but when you see statistically that women across every domain, girls especially across every domain, are oftentimes first targeted with sort of the worst uses, um,
Hmm.
we just have to hold ourselves to a higher standard, and that has to include considerations for the experiences that they have with this technology. And I'm still waiting on that. I think there's a lot of work to be done societally to value the experiences of girls. There's still a punchline in jokes being a
Hmm.
teenage girl. And as we often say in our program, there's no one we'd rather have in our corner than a group of teenage girls who have lived through some hard stuff and have come out
Yeah.
on the other side. So um, I think there's a lot of progress to be made, but I don't think it will happen without generations reaching back and lifting the others alongside them, because these are multi-generational challenges.
Yeah. Well, and I think the work that you're doing with girl security really strikes just right at the heart of it by training these young leaders, which I think will then in turn they'll train the next generation of leaders, and it can't help but bring change over time. So
I
thank
agree.
you, Lauren, so much for your time today and for joining me on the podcast. What's the best way that people can keep up with you and with Girl Security? Is it the website, LinkedIn? What?
Yeah, both. The website is girlsecurity.org, and find me on LinkedIn because we're always posting. You can find Girl Security on LinkedIn too.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.